Rumors of John Wayne slipping into Memphis. Whispers that Burt Reynolds had been smuggled inside a bread truck. A persistent story that Sammy Davis Jr. was somewhere inside the mansion. For more than 40 years, the guest list at the most famous funeral in music history has been buried under legend. And almost everything the average fan believes about who stood inside Graceland on August 18, 1977, turns out to be wrong. This is the record, corrected name by name, and the truth is stranger than the myth. When Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, at the age of 42, the world did not simply mourn. It descended on Memphis. Contemporary accounts describe crowds so dense around the Graceland gates that President Jimmy Carter called out roughly 300 National Guard troops to keep order. The white-columned mansion, once a place of late-night racquetball and gospel singing, became the center of a national vigil. Fans slept on the sidewalks. Flowers arrived by the truckload from across the country. All city buildings in Memphis lowered their flags to half-staff. After the body was embalmed at the Memphis funeral home and returned to Graceland, a public viewing was set up in the foyer on Vernon Presley's orders, and over 30,000 people filed past the open casket to see the king one last time. But the funeral itself, held the next afternoon, was a different kind of event. It was small, it was private, and that privacy is exactly what turned it into a mystery. The service ran about 2 hours, beginning at 2 in the afternoon, in the living room at Graceland. Reverend C.W. Bradley of Memphis led it. Because the doors were closed to the press and to the fans outside, nobody watching from the street could confirm who was inside. So the crowd did what crowds do. They guessed. And the guesses hardened into stories that outlived everyone who could have corrected them. The biggest of those stories involved the biggest names. For decades, fans have repeated that John Wayne came to pay his respects to the king, the Duke and the rock star, two American icons under one roof. It is a perfect image, and it is easy to see why people wanted it to be true. But the contemporary reporting on the funeral says plainly that the John Wayne sighting was only a rumor, and that he was not there. The same reporting knocks down an even wilder tale, that Burt Reynolds had been secretly smuggled into Graceland hidden inside a bread truck to slip past the crowds at the gates. As cinematic as that sounds, it never happened. And the story that Sammy Davis Jr. was somewhere inside the mansion falls apart in exactly the same way. According to the people documenting the event as it actually unfolded, none of those three men was present. The rumors of their identities, one account noted, were among the most persistent things generated in the chaos of that week, and they attached themselves to the funeral so tightly that they are still being repeated today as fact. That is the first correction, and it is a big one, because those are the names most videos on this subject still put front and center. But if the icons everyone remembers were never there, the next question writes itself. Were there any real celebrities inside at all? Or was the whole thing invented? There were, and here the story splits into two groups that fans constantly blur together. The first group came to Graceland but never attended the service. On the night before the funeral, two genuinely famous people were at the mansion to pay quiet respects. One was Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the late President John F. Kennedy. Her presence connected the world of Washington political dynasty to the world of Memphis rock and roll, and it is often held up as proof of how far Elvis's reach really extended, from teenage record buyers to the family of a sitting president. The other was the soul legend James Brown, often called the Godfather of Soul, who had known Elvis since 1966 and took the death especially hard. By some accounts, Brown asked for a moment alone and sat with the body for a long stretch of time, two pioneers of American music in a silent room. But here is what almost every retelling gets wrong. Both Caroline Kennedy and James Brown were at Graceland the evening before the funeral. Neither of them stayed for the service the following afternoon. So every guest list that files those two names among the funeral attendees has quietly blurred a visit into an attendance. They were mourners at the house, not guests at the ceremony. And the distinction is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a story is repeated enough times. Which leaves the people who actually were inside that living room. And this is the list that was real all along. Anne Margaret was there. She had co-starred with Elvis in Viva Las Vegas back in 1964, sharing a screen chemistry that fans still talk about, and the two had remained close for years afterward. She attended with her husband, the actor Roger Smith, and moved through the grieving household carrying a friendship that reached all the way back to those film sets of the early 60s. Beside the confirmed guests stood the actor George Hamilton, a Tennessean who knew Presley's music well and had actually seen him perform the summer before he died. By his own recollection, he had grown up more of a Beatles fan, but living near Memphis, he said, you could not help but know Elvis, because the man was larger than life. The guitarist Chet Atkins, a titan of the Nashville sound who had shaped so much of the recording world Elvis moved through, was on hand as well. And in the mix of mourners was Sam Phillips, the former owner of Sun Records, the very label that had first captured Elvis's voice on tape and set the whole story in motion more than 20 years earlier. And then there was the man whose presence would shape what happened next. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager of more than 2 decades, arrived in Memphis dressed not in mourning black, but in a Hawaiian shirt and a baseball cap, chewing his trademark cigar. It was reported that even in the middle of the funeral, Parker moved to persuade Vernon Presley to sign control of Elvis's career, in death, over to him. The king was not yet in the ground, and the business of Elvis was already being renegotiated. The service itself carried its own names. Television evangelist Rex Humbard, who had known Elvis, spoke during the ceremony. The comedian Jackie Kahane, who had opened Presley's live shows for years, delivered a testimonial. And Elvis's favorite gospel voices filled the room. J.D. Sumner and the Stamps, the Statesman, and the singer, Kathy Westmoreland, performing the hymns he had loved. If you are following along, this is the real guest list, and you may have noticed something. Not a single one of the 3 names the myth is built on appears anywhere on it. But the confirmed celebrities were never the heart of that room. They were the edges of it. At the center was Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, in a black pinstripe suit, a man who had followed his son from a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, to the gates of Graceland and now had to bury him. When the family filed into the crypt to touch the copper casket one by one, Vernon stood with his hand on his son's coffin for a long moment, and he had to be supported when he finally left. Near him was Priscilla Presley, Elvis's former wife, and their daughter Lisa Marie, only 9 years old, holding on in a house that had gone silent. And beyond the walls were the tens of thousands who had no invitation and came anyway. The great mass of mourners, as one account put it, were not the beautiful people, but the plain and the ordinary, arriving from every corner of the country, many of them not expecting to see anything at all, wanting only to be present at the king's end. After 2 short prayers and a poem, the seamless copper casket, flown to Memphis from Oklahoma City and blanketed in rosebuds, was wheeled out and carried in a white hearse toward Forest Hill Cemetery, where Elvis was laid to rest beside his mother, Gladys. A long line of cars followed the hearse through the streets. Thousands lined the route in the summer heat, and in one of the most haunting images of the day, a Memphis policeman was photographed carrying away a young woman who had broken from the crowd and lunged toward the hearse, desperate to reach him one last time. So how did the myth ever take hold? The answer is in the privacy itself. A closed service with no cameras and no press is a vacuum, and rumor rushes in to fill it. A John Wayne who might plausibly have come becomes a John Wayne who did. A wish that Burt Reynolds paid tribute hardens, retelling after retelling, into a specific bread truck and a specific getaway. The stories were never lies exactly. They were hopes that calcified into history because no one inside the closed doors stepped out to correct them. And because the truth, a modest 2-hour service in a living room, felt smaller than the man deserved in the public imagination. People wanted the king to be sent off by a room full of kings. So over the decades, the guest list grew in the retelling, gathering names Elvis never actually gathered, until the version most fans know today is more legend than record. The real list is stranger than the legend precisely because it is human. A movie co-star and her husband, a guitarist, an evangelist, a comedian, a father who could not stand on his own, and a manager already counting the money. That is who buried Elvis Presley. Not a parade of untouchable icons, but the people who had actually been in his life, gathered in one room while 100,000 strangers waited in the heat outside. Elvis has been gone for decades now, and every August the candles still gather at those gates. The myths will keep circulating, because they always do. But the people who were truly there tell a quieter and truer story about who the king really belonged to at the end. If you want to understand the strangeness of what happened to his body and his estate in the years after, that story is waiting for you next.